Good afternoon. Please take your seats so we can start the session. Okay. I'd like to welcome you to the third of the series of keynote lectures on the face of the Earth. We had very interesting lectures on Monday and Tuesday on rocks and water, respectively. And today, our focus is on life in the Earth. And I'm particularly pleased to welcome today's keynote speaker, Andrew Watson from the University of Exeter. Andrew, the stage is yours.
Good afternoon. I can be heard. You can hear me? Is that fine? Kind of walk fine.
No, it doesn't work.
Okay. It's not working? Okay. Oh, just a second.
Can you put it the other way around?
The other way around. Oh. Right, okay. Can you do it for me? Okay, is that any better? I had the mic on the wrong way around, so you would hear my stomach gurgling, but not me. Okay, it's a great honour to try and give this lecture this afternoon. Like the speakers before me, I have a difficult task ahead: 45 minutes to describe all the life on the Earth. I hope if you'll forgive me if I don't mention your favourite organism, I'll try to get through most of them. So, I thought to begin with, if this will work, there we go, that we should remind ourselves of where we are, the place that we are. Is it working? Try again, here we go, yes, okay. This is the Hubble far field. We live in an enormous universe with something like 10 to the 12, 10 to the 13 galaxies in it that we can see. Of course, there are many that are probably beyond our vision. For all we know, the universe might be infinite. If we focus down then on one galaxy and on one star, the Earth is seen to be unbelievably small and insignificant. So these are a few shots, not actual photographs, I have to admit. Here's the Earth, which is really a binary planet system because the Moon is almost big enough to be a planet. And we come to this face that we are familiar with, the face of the Earth. And you can see immediately, why is it? Oh, okay, there we go. But this is an unusual planet. It's unusual for the reasons we heard about yesterday, in that it has water on the surface. In fact, you can see water in all its three phases on the surface. There's vapor in the clouds, liquid water, and ice. And as we know now, recently really found out, that there are very many planets around us, that most stars perhaps have planets. This is the Kepler mission, which at the moment, which has confirmed nearly 1,000 planets around relatively nearby stars. So planets are very common, but how common would planets like Earth be? That's a different matter and still to be worked out as yet. We know the
Just let me know when we pass the slides.
sorry?
Just let me know and I'll pass the slides.
Oh, okay, next slide. We know the familiar Goldilocks paradox. Venus is too hot, Mars is too cold, and the Earth is just right. This is the Goldilocks paradox. So the Earth is in, and if we look down on the surface of these 3 planets, which form the inner parts of the inner solar system, they look in some respects rather similar on the land surface. So this is Mars and Venus. This is one of only a couple of photos taken on Venus before the spacecraft melted. And then this is the Earth. If you go somewhere where there is no water, the Atacama Desert, it looks remarkably similar. It's a rocky desert. But wherever there is liquid water on Earth, you see something quite different. There is a life and an abundance of it, and the more water there is, it seems, the more life there is. So, this is the best picture I could get for the habitable zone. There are lots of graphics on the internet, but none of them are any more realistic than this one. The habitable zone is a relatively narrow region around a star in which liquid water can exist on the surface of a planet. The Earth is clearly inside it, and Mars is probably inside it, although it's too small now to have liquid water on it. The zone is narrow, and we believe that the Earth is situated today very much towards the inner edge of it. The habitable zone is slowly moving outwards as the sun gets brighter as it ages. So the Earth does not actually have that much longer to go. It has had a longer time in the habitable zone than it has yet still to go in it, perhaps only about 1 billion years, so it's 80% of the way through its life. If we look at the compositions of the atmospheres of these 3 planets, we can see immediately the action of life. Earth's atmosphere is radically different from those of Mars and Venus. Mars and Venus have atmospheres that are dominated by carbon dioxide with some nitrogen. Oxygen is present at very low concentrations only. For the Earth, oxygen is present at 21%. The carbon dioxide is at very low concentrations. So something is happening on Earth. Earth also has trace concentrations of much more reducing gases, such as nitrous oxide, hydrogen and methane. And it was James Lovelock that pointed out 50 years ago that the coexistence of gases far from thermodynamic equilibrium means that something is happening on the surface of this planet which is highly energetic and is producing gases rapidly, and that something is life. So if we try to reconstruct the atmosphere of the Earth as it would be without life, it looks very similar to the concentrations that one finds on Mars and Venus. It would have lots of carbon dioxide. It would have essentially no oxygen. So I want now to look at Earth history and ask the question, how is it and when did Earth get to become like this? How did it come as we see it today? So the Earth's history is divided into eons, the Hadean, Archean, Proterozoic and Phanerozoic. And there have been a series of relatively constant world orders within these eons, and between them major transitions, revolutions, when the planetary environment changed. And these, in particular, back at the beginning of, we're not really sure whether life was present on the Earth when it was formed or shortly after it was formed, but it is present from certainly the earliest rocks that one might expect it to be any evidence for life to be present. It's there. For the first 2 billion years or so of the planet's history, the atmosphere is reducing, or at least not strongly oxidizing. There's no oxygen present. And then there's an oxidation event, the Great Oxidation as it's called, and simultaneously almost with that there are a set of extreme glaciations. Later on, at the end of the Proterozoic, there are another set of extreme glaciations and evidence again that the whole environment of the Earth was changing. So we have these, in particular the Great Oxidation and the Neoproterozoic, we have these revolutions dividing up the history of the Earth. And these revolutions were driven, I would suggest, by life, by major biological innovations which caused change in the environment, and that global change then drove further change in the biology of the Earth. So we have two parts of a system that are interacting one with another, each driving the other. But it's usually life that starts the process. It's the source of innovation, if you like. So first, to look at oxygenic photosynthesis, which was is responsible for the first of those revolutions at about 2.4 billion years, the Great Oxidation. Now, oxygenic photosynthesis appears to have been invented on this planet just once by one cell, an ancestral cyanobacterial cell. It was invented somewhere between 3.5 and 2.7 billion years ago, we think. It's worth just pausing on that and what would have happened if that cell had not invented oxygenic photosynthesis. None of what we normally think of as the life today would be present on this planet. So this single cell did something which changed the planet more than anything before or since. This was, you can certainly, for us who are oxygen-breathing animals, and for practically all of the life around us that we care about, this, of course, was a good thing. It was probably a lucky event. The fact that it took a billion years or more before it actually occurred suggests that it wasn't inevitable by any means. It may have been good for us, looking back on it, but when we think about most of the organisms on the planet at the time, it wouldn't have been good because they would have been poisoned by oxygen. Oxygenic photosynthesis is an amazing piece of biochemistry. The sum reaction, the net reaction, is that oxygen from two water molecules is liberated as oxygen gas, as molecular oxygen, and carbon from carbon dioxide is ultimately fixed into organics. But in the process of doing that, which sounds, chemically sounds quite simple, is actually extraordinarily complicated. There's a fundamental problem in that the amount of energy required to split the water and liberate the oxygen is more than is in any single photon of energy coming from the sun. So the oxygenic photosynthesis therefore requires, or the way that it's done, is that two simpler photosynthetic systems are coupled together. They are called photosystem 1 and photosystem 2. I'm not going to describe to you how they work. You'll be pleased to hear, because we'd be here all day, and anyway, I can't understand it myself. These two photosystems are coupled together with a unique and elaborate water-splitting complex, which is a system, a molecular system, which is able to store the energy in a sort of ratchet or spring type of mechanism, and also to store electric charge, and enables the single electrons coming from the photosynthetic systems, from the photosystems, to be stored up until there's enough energy there to do the water splitting. And this is what it looks like. As I say, it's another extremely complex piece of apparatus, but it has 5 states in total, and it's ratcheted from one state to the next by each photon of energy, and finally the 5th state decays to the first state, releasing the energy and the electric charge in the process. In total then 8 photons are used to produce one oxygen molecule. Photosystem 1 and photosystem 2 are found, or things that look very similar to them are found within other bacteria, but it's only the cyanobacteria that have both, and also the water splitting complex, and therefore only the cyanobacteria amongst the bacteria that can do this trick of producing oxygen. And so one can see in the this is the tree, a bacterial and archaeal tree of life, and some of the organisms that have photosystem 1 and photosystem 2 are shown here, but this is only the cyanobacteria here that have both photosystem 1 and photosystem 2 and the water splitting complex. They and the chloroplasts in all other oxygen-producing organisms, because all of the subsequent oxygen-producing organisms, such as the plants that we see around us today, have taken in some sense, they have co-opted a cyanobacteria and got them to live inside them. So they're endosymbionts, and they are closely, so those organelles inside the modern plant cells are closely related to and come from the cyanobacteria and this single event. Yes. Right, yes, and you can see the point at which this occurs on this diagram. It's because this diagram is, of course, also in some sense, it's a history diagram. It shows earlier organisms and later evolved organisms, and you can see the point in time at which this single event occurred, in a sense, in this diagram. So, the point then about oxygen production is that eventually it allowed the production of far more complex organisms than the prokaryotes, the bacteria that had lived on the planet up to that time. Several hundred million years probably after oxygenic photosynthesis was invented, the atmosphere became oxidized. Before that time, you get occasional whiffs of oxygen in the record, but free oxygen suddenly appeared at about 2.4 billion years ago. This is a record of an isotope ratio, which I won't go into, but which shows quite clearly when it's scattered, basically there's no oxygen in the atmosphere. When it's no longer scattered, there is free oxygen in the atmosphere. And quite clearly, at this point, at around 2.4 billion years ago, the atmosphere changed from non-oxidizing to oxidizing, and it never went back. The ozone layer would have formed at that time. And immediately around that time, also, there is a climate catastrophe. The change in the atmosphere caused removal of greenhouse gases and a massive cooling, very severe glaciations, possibly snowball Earth type events. And these glaciations lasted for a long period of time, greater than 10 million years, certainly. And eventually, the climate recovered to a new stable state as organisms learned to reprocess the oxygen and recycle it to carbon dioxide. So it was a process of learning to live with the waste products that the oxygenic photosynthesizers had produced. And so at that point there was oxygen in the atmosphere, and this allowed more complex organisms to develop. And these were the eukaryotes. Now eukaryotes are much larger than prokaryote cells, the bacteria and archaea that preceded them. Of course, there are many bacteria and archaea still on the planet today, and they're still vitally important for the biogeochemistry of the planet. But this new kind of supercell, if you like, evolved around 2 billion years ago, and it clearly has got something to do with the fact that oxygen was in the atmosphere. The eukaryote cells are much larger. They have a lot of organelles inside them, and which in some of those cases these organelles appear to have been derived from other bacteria and archaea that have been captured by them and become endosymbionts. They have the vast majority of them are aerobic, so they require oxygen and they use it to generate lots of energy, whereas by contrast a lot of bacteria are killed by oxygen. They're much larger, and perhaps most importantly they've got a lot more DNA which they can copy much more efficiently than can prokaryotes and bacteria. This gives them the potential to produce much more complex organisms and multicellular organisms, because, okay, an organism such as us, all of our cells have the same DNA, but there are many different sorts of cells in our body, and all of that information to code for those many different cells has to be included in our genome, in the DNA. So you need more DNA for such more complex organisms. There follows then, after the evolution of the eukaryotes, about 1 billion years, which geologists sometimes call the boring billion, because they like action, they like glaciations and meteorites hitting the planet, and nothing much seems to be happening during that time. And it's true too that nothing much seems to be happening with the life on the planet. But when you look more carefully, you find that there is, in fact, plenty of happening. So as I say, what was life doing in the Proterozoic? It was learning to differentiate, which is not, I don't mean it was learning calculus. Differentiation is, in this instance, means that becoming multicellular with different kinds of cells within the organism. So one first sees some really something that looked pretty much like eukaryotes at about 2 billion years ago. These are called Grippania. These things are large, like 2 centimeters across. It's not really known what they are. At about 1.5 billion years ago, this fossil has been seen. These are all very small, of course. This is clearly, Tapania as it's called, looks very much like it might be an early fungus. It's got things sticking out of it which look like hyphae, the hyphae of a fungus. It seems to have some internal structure in its cell, so possibly an early fungi by 1.5 billion years ago. And then at about 1 billion years ago, we have this thing called Bandiomorpha, which is described by Nick Butterfield. And this is clearly, it's like a modern organism in the sense that it has got several different types of cells. It's remarkably small. You can see it's only 50 microns across, but it's assigned to a still existing class of red algae. And you can see that it has, for instance, some special shaped cells down here in the towards the bottom of it, which Nick, who's an expert and I'm not, tells us it can definitively put it in this class of organisms. So this organism is able to form many different cell types from its and it's multicellular, of course. So after 1.5 billion years of stability, there is a further series of extreme glaciations in the Neoproterozoic. And these also controversially, some people think they're snowballs, some people don't. I know that geologists fight over this. I don't want to get into that fight. They were bad, very terrible glaciations, and they lasted for long periods of time. The cause is controversial, but my candidate would be that this was the first evidence for life invading the land and starting to weather the land surfaces. So one would imagine we now have definitely algae, which are multicellular. We have definitely fungi on the planet. It seems sensible that these fungi and these algae would be getting together and forming lichen-like associations. So this would increase the productivity of the Earth because these pre-plants are beginning to spread across the land surface. Would accelerate the weathering of the land surfaces and would draw down carbon dioxide, so it could be a cause for global cooling. We would also expect it to increase the flow of nutrients to the oceans, and that would cause oxygen to go up further than it was at that time. So towards the end of those glaciations, animals appear. There is this period called the Ediacaran, or Ediacaran, and these days these creatures, which are very some of the strangest in the fossil record, but most people seem to think that they're probably animals, and this is a modern sea pen which looks a bit like them, although it's possible that the artist drew them to look like sea pens, so I'm not quite sure whether that's how good that is. But so yeah, the animals evolved, and we're animals, so one would like to know that there's something special about animals, and indeed there is something special about animals. Animal cells are mostly terminally differentiated. What that means is that if I cut off my hand, I'm not going to be able to grow another me by putting that in the right environment and allowing it to grow. But with most plants and fungi, you can in fact do that. Under the right circumstances, their cells, though differentiated, can switch back, and any of the cells in the organism can produce the entire organisms. But in animals, that's not possible. So this is totipotency, such as plants have. So gardeners can take a cutting and produce the whole plant, versus terminal differentiation. Also, animals are much more differentiated than our humans. We have, for instance, upwards of 200 different types of cells in our body. Most plants have only a dozen at the most. So animals are the differentiators par excellence. So there's a sense in which animal cells are highly altruistic. they're committed to mutual cooperation. Now, my cells, for example, most of my cells are not ultimately going to be able to pass their genes on to another organism. They have to rely on the other cells in my body, my reproductive cells, to be able to do that. So they are, in a very real sense, they're committed to a very deep cooperation. They cannot survive without that cooperation. And it's interesting to ask the question whether there's a link between these severe glaciations from which the animals apparently emerged and this and the emergence of this curious property. And so if you think of terminal differentiation, this process that animals undergo, as an extreme form of altruism, altruism has always been a problem for evolutionary biologists to describe and to explain, because altruists' genes can only be successful if most of the population has them. So in other words, where most of the population is cooperating and excluding cheats. If there are only a few altruists, they can't make progress. The cheats will get them, basically. So how do altruists and altruistic populations ever get going? How did animals then ever, these multicellular communities, which is what an animal is, how did they ever get to the point where they were completely committed to their cooperation? So the hypothesis then is that extreme glaciations would have favored the evolution of extreme altruism. And you can kind of see why that might happen. Normally, in conditions where different populations can quickly share each other, can disperse one into the other, if you get a few altruists evolving, they are swiftly overwhelmed by cheats. But if there was a snowball Earth and the proto-animals that were just about to evolve were therefore confined to refuges such as near hot springs or near hydrothermal vents, just a few places from which they could not move easily one to another. So if you have small populations like that, you might by chance get one which has got more altruists in it. And if you then leave it there for a long period of time, so most of the populations here have many cheats in them, but the ones that have altruists in them do better because they've got more altruists, and because ultimately, if the whole population works together, then altruism can win out. So under normal conditions, the altruists can't win, but under conditions of life in refugia, then the small groups that have got cheats in eventually die out, and eventually, when the glaciations recede, it's the altruists then that inherit the Earth. So possibly there is a link between the evolution of animals and these very harsh conditions that went on for millions of years. So anyway, we've reached the Neoproterozoic, and there is an explosion at that time of animal groups. There are plants by this time beginning, or pre-plants beginning to cover the land surfaces, causing oxygen to go up further, causing carbon dioxide to come down further. So in a sense, we've reached the modern world. Plants on land and the fungi that are associated with them increase the rate at which the land surface is eroded and weathered, and the consequences of that are an increased oxygen supply and probably decreased carbon dioxide. And we reach essentially the modern world, one where you have animals, the one that we know about, with large animals, large plants covering the land surface, up to the modern, the very modern world today. So, to summarize, there have been revolutions on Earth periodically, a few, at least two that I've talked about today. These revolutions involve the use of an increasing amount of energy by a class of newly evolved organisms, be they oxygenic photosynthesizers or the land colonizers. The organisms responsible were very successful, but that success changes the atmosphere and caused climate change. And this might begin to sound familiar to you. Stability was eventually restored in these former cases when the biosphere evolved to recycle the waste products of the innovators, and once again one had a stable system. The Earth then is a system which is open to energy transfer from the sun, but is closed to mass transfer. That means that the nutrients must all of the mass, the materials, have to be recycled with nearly 100% efficiency at the surface of the planet if an active and very rapidly overturning biosphere is to be maintained. Evolutionary innovations then can only be sustained indefinitely if the products are recycled completely. So, in the Anthropocene, we're going to encounter this problem over and over again, and we've seen it already many times with ozone depletion. The current problem is the carbon dioxide and climate. If we solve that one, there will be many more such problems to come. But the interesting thing then is that it's not per se the energy budget or the lack of energy which is our problem. This is the Earth's energy budget. A lot of energy is incident from the sun, about half of it reaches the ground. The possible solar renewable potential that we could harness with our existing technology of solar power is on the order of 0.2 petawatts. So we could put potentially one can see how one could use make that much solar energy available. This is larger than the total amount of energy currently today captured by all the land plants on the land. And this is the amount of energy that humans currently use, largely from fossil fuels. So you see that the possible renewable energy potential is substantially larger than our current usage of fossil fuels. So where next then for humans? Tim Lenton and I have recently written a book in which we lay out this Earth history and say what lessons can we learn from this. And this is published by Oxford University Press. We lay out three possible futures. Firstly, if we do nothing, we're going to end with catastrophic climate change, as in the previous revolutions on Earth. We could retreat into a world where we use much less energy. We would need to have fewer humans with a lower standard of living, and some environmentalists see that as the only way forward. Or we could go to a yet higher energy world where we use that clean energy, solar energy, but we recycle, we put much more effort into recycling our materials using some of that energy so that we have an indefinitely sustainable biosphere, including humans. So energy supply is not a limiting factor on human development. The materials are the limiting factor. And these can be recycled using energy. It's energetically expensive to really recycle well, but the energy is available. So in principle, an indefinitely sustainable biosphere with 10 billion humans, for example, is achievable, and humans then become one of those successful revolutions that have changed the Earth. So we would use the abundant solar energy on Earth to recycle materials just in the same way as the biosphere has done it before. So if you move away from the Earth, this picture is one of my favorites. This is the, you can perhaps see where, this is the Earth taken from 4 billion miles away by the Voyager 1, beyond the orbit of Saturn, the furthest away we've ever seen the Earth from. As Carl Sagan said, you know, if you must look hard at that, because that little spot is where every human, everybody who's ever lived, has lived there, on that tiny place. So, life has completely changed the environment, utterly changed the Earth environment. You can think of life and the Earth environment, the surface environment, as a single part of a system which is evolving, especially through these transitions. And humans are really part of that. And human imagination and intelligence can be thought of as the latest innovation, a bit like photosynthesis, or a bit like land colonization and the eukaryote cell. We're changing the Earth system like those organisms before us. We are making dangerous and profound changes. But unlike those past revolutions, we know what we're doing. We have foresight and scientific knowledge. And we don't have to wait and hope that evolution will get things right. There's no guarantee it will. But we do have to work it out for ourselves, because in this big universe, it's quite clear that nobody's going to come and help us, and there isn't anywhere else to go. So thank you.